It's an issue that's important to you, but you've painted out, I think, the problem really well, right? But my question is more specifically, and just as a follow-up, you speak to so many sort of heads of state, former heads of state. What's one lesson, perhaps, that you've learned about how they should deal specifically with the challenge of far-right populism? If you were to speak to Scholz or to Macron, what's the right response to this?
Well, look, there is no single response. Yeah. I mean, as member of Club de Madrid, I was sent for missions where countries needed advice and discussion. So I was in places like Sri Lanka. I went to Jaffna Peninsula, which has come out of a bitter civil war, and talk to people in detail about things without pretending that I come with solutions. I don't have solutions, but I can be, I can be a partner in a discussion as representative of, Club de Madrid. And I don't want to propagate that. I just want to say that there is a need for a discussion where country-specific solutions are being worked out. In Armenia, where I was also, the situation was very different. It was how to support the market-oriented small businesses in Armenia, largely led by women. Mm-hmm. To a hall like this with as many people like here, and all women, young women who are establishing their companies. And they were really very interested about this experience of Slovenia. Again, I didn't come to lecture there. We were engaged in a discussion. So, in short, there are many questions that are mostly country-specific or situation-specific, and they have to be given specific answers. International cooperation can help, but the answers will come from within. And again, democracy is a little bit like love.
Kristijan, let me go to you, and just picking up where President Türk left off. You pointed out in your previous comments that the need for immigration and the demographic decline in many parts of Europe. And again, I was studying this case of Germany, the two states that voted for the AfD in the highest numbers, right? These are the two states that are suffering most from demographic decline in Germany. Both of them are projected to lose between 20 to 40% of their workforce before 2030, in the next 6 years, right? So if they're losing those record amounts of their workforce, and they're also opposed to replenishing the population through more immigration, well, what do we do then? How do you reconcile, on the one hand, the need for more immigration, on the other hand, the constantly receding support for it in places like Germany?
Yeah, I think that's an excellent question, Manas, and I'm not a Germany expert, so I'm not going to pretend to be one, but I will comment a little bit on the situation which we all have been following, of course. I mean, it looks like the two states that you referenced are also two of the states with the lowest share of foreign population, actually, in Germany. So this kind of very lazy media headlines that we have been seeing about these states responding, to immigration, especially from different ethnicities and races, and this perhaps prompting people to vote in a more intolerant direction are false, at least in terms of the numbers, in terms of the demography. But in terms of the overall demographic situation and population aging, Germany as a whole has been suffering a lot from this. And I would like to echo the comment made by President Türk before. I mean, it's definitely the case of a diagnostic approach being required to populism. You go to each country, to each specific context, and you try to diagnose the specific problems facing that country. There is no silver bullet here. There is no one solution. But one of the most commonly proposed solutions in general, of course, is to just focus on the underlying socioeconomic situation, rather than dismissing people as politically or ethnically intolerant. And of course, Germany has been underinvesting a lot recently. It has been suffering, first of all, the most probably in Europe from the aftermath of the war in Ukraine, but it has also responded to the crisis in a very passive fashion, refusing to, of course, increase public spending, being perhaps over-concerned about its public debt. And this has, of course, caused some frustrations among voters. Now, there are much bigger historical factors at play here. I mean, East German states, unfortunately, have a long track record by now of supporting populist parties, both on the far left and far right. But we definitely shouldn't ignore either socioeconomics or demography when we talk about this. And of course, when I think of my region of expertise and also of origin, Central and Eastern Europe, it is clear that not only far right, but even more mainstream, if you like, conservative parties are always better placed to exploit these anxieties of population aging. We see that conservatives, this kind of vocabulary simply comes naturally to them to sort of articulate this picture of demographic decline as a form of apocalypse, if you like. And one of the challenges that we face as population researchers and practitioners is to try and paint these demographic phenomena that I have been speaking about today as ideologically neutral phenomena, to go back to the very kind of objective socioeconomic negative, usually, implications that stem from them that I tried to point out in the beginning. And just as a final point, perhaps for now, especially in the CEE region, where we're also seeing a lot of emigration of young and therefore usually more progressive people, although even that picture is changing because we're seeing now in these German elections that young voters have been some of the staunchest supporters of the populist parties. But generally it is the case of young and more progressive people emigrating away from Eastern Europe and therefore leaving behind them a more conservative population, which then in turn is more likely to support conservative politicians and parties.
Yeah. And let's drill down perhaps into the socioeconomics of this, because you pointed this out, Ambassador. As you pointed out, Kristijan, sometimes these are socioeconomic anxieties that are captured by ideological agendas. Germany's been underperforming. It's the worst performing economy in the G7 since 2018. Second quarter of this year, the economy actually contracted, right? One of the only, or possibly the only economy in Europe to shrink at the same time when the Russian economy is growing. Right? And so you're faced with these problems. Here's my question to you, which is, on the one hand, we want countries of the global south, want the international financial framework to be reworked to support them. On the other hand, there's countries in the global north, countries like Germany, which, even if there's a somewhat slight decline in economic productivity, it leads to these political ramifications that are worse for developing countries. How do you reconcile these two?
Thank you. I think, we have been witnessing a rise in inequality, global inequality, that really has taken a scale unprecedented a bit between countries, but also within societies. And that inequality is rising, is linked to a number of economic policies, monetary policies, financial policies. And the lack of willingness to tackle or to address this inequalities through public policy, through taxation. We see it also in the issue of the International Tax Convention in the UN and the opposition to it. That is making political forces who do not want to tackle the socioeconomic aspect to resort to identity but they're all linked, including trade policies. I just want to mention there was an African president from a Sahel country who was asked about a region in his country where there's a particular source of migrants going to Europe. And he explained that in that region, there had been a collapse of the agricultural system and agricultural production as a result of subsidized imports from abroad and in Europe. So the agriculture subsidies in some countries, etc., and their impact that there's a direct link of not reforming that. This is something developing countries, African countries have demanded with, migration flows. So it's all linked in terms of not willing to reform international and financial monetary policies, not tackling global inequality and the migration issue. But also broader than Europe, we are witnessing, and that goes back again to my area, in conflict, in many parts of the world, we are witnessing what I would call the weaponization of identity by political forces to pursue political objectives, and by terrorist groups, by others, and that is really again creating humongous challenges in terms of conflict resolution. because a conflict resolution is easier between groups who have different political interests, but once identity politics come into play, it becomes much more complex. But even in those cases, again, there is socio-economic factors at work, grievances, and again, lack of tackling, again, all these global imbalances we find in finance, in monetary policy, in trade, and other aspects.
Yeah, so those imbalances between the North and the South are linked, they're not competing priorities. Madam President, let me come to you with a slightly different question. I think we're having this conversation perhaps at the perfect time, because we saw news last night that Vladimir Putin, war criminal Vladimir Putin, made a state visit to Mongolia. And correct me if I'm wrong, but Mongolia is a member state of the ICC, and as a result has an obligation, both a moral obligation, but also a concrete legal obligation to arrest Putin, given that the ICC issued a warrant for him last year. And yet we saw pictures of him coming off the plane, being greeted by state officials, and Mongolia refused to arrest him. So my question is this: when you see events like these, when you see countries that are party to the ICC effectively violate its most core tenets, what do you think that does to the credibility of the ICC and its international standing?
Yes, indeed. Of course, it's regrettable that we have a situation where the states parties are not able to cooperate with the court. I think it is essential that the court is able to continue to focus on its core function as a judicial and impartial institution. And it's for the states parties to allow it to do so and support it to do so. So there are many ways how states parties shall and can cooperate with the court, especially as the court does not have police forces of their own. It cannot arrest indictees, since there is no territory of the International Criminal Court per se. So we need definitely cooperation by states parties and under certain conditions also other states. We need the cooperation by international organizations. We need the cooperation of NGOs. So the court can only function if this cooperation exists. And the Rome Statute does have certain mechanisms how this is being dealt with. Of course, I would not go into the field of the judiciary, which shall determine whether non-cooperation has happened. That is for the court to decide. But if there is such a situation, the issue may be referred to the Assembly of States Parties, and then, of course, the states parties shall look into what measures can be taken. The Rome Statute does not provide any specific. It does not describe the nature of the measures that the Assembly can do in such situations. But of course there are concrete issues that can be done, and the Assembly has already before agreed on certain procedures how this can be handled, and also a very concrete toolkit what kind of reactions it may entail.
Yeah, and just as a follow-up, if I was to go into that, what is that toolkit? Because on the one hand, I understand the ICC doesn't have its own police force, doesn't have that jurisdiction. On the other hand, on the softest end, you've got words of condemnation, which we've heard before, which we know don't work. In the middle of that spectrum, is there anything that the ICC can do? And as President of the Assembly of States, when you see countries like Mongolia, let's say if the court finds that there's been non-cooperation here, which I think is likely, then what do you think should be the concrete legal consequences to a country like Mongolia, especially as the international community watches on?
I said that the Rome Statute does not describe the nature of measures, but what is clear that the measures that the Assembly of States Parties can do is it's not of a judicial nature. Mm-hmm. So it is more of those soft measures that are at hand for the Assembly of States parties, and of course that is what is, and also states, individual states, we see them reacting against such situations. So I think the political and diplomatic measures are very much the ones that are being used.
Yeah. I mean, in a way, it sounds like we're at a situation that is sort of truly unprecedented, so we'll have to wait to watch exactly how the court and the Assembly of States react. You know, I want to go to sort of questions from the audience as well. We've had a very vibrant discussion. I'm sure there's plenty. But before I do that, could I have the young BSF, are there any in the room, put their hand up, part of the younger program? Maybe they're a little bit shy. That's okay, we'll come back to you. I'm going to ask one final question, and we'll go sort of rapid fire. Please limit your answers to less than 60 seconds, and then I'll turn to audience questions. And my question is this, which is, we have this neoliberal orthodoxy. To put it simply, we think everything can be measured in economic progress and GDP. But maybe it can't. You know, maybe there's other dimensions of progress and of prosperity that we aren't capturing through this sort of, you know, much more crude measure. If I were to go around the panel and ask you, you know, what's one dimension of stability, of peace, of prosperity? What's one dimension? What should we be measuring that we don't measure right now that is an indicator of the things that we want to see happen at Summit of the Future beyond economic measures like GDP? Ambassador, can I start with you?
Well, I mean, the criticism against GDP is a long one. You know, you have the human development reports of UNDP that focus on human development. But I would say, I would go back to inequality. I mean, it's only been a couple of years that we are grappling with measuring inequality. I mean, the French economist Thomas Piketty had this milestone work on measuring inequality. So I think even if a society had GDP growth, but the inequalities grow also, that is extremely problematic and creates social tensions that impact the political spectrum. And we see it, as I was mentioning. So that would be an issue that we need to better measure and understand beyond GDP.
Yeah,
and tackle.
Exactly the need for this sort of ideological identity politics.
Yeah.
We're seeing damaging effects of. Madam President, what's one indicator, one measure that we're overlooking right now?
That may well go beyond my field of expertise. I'm not sure whether I know all the details what are being measured, but if I have to raise something, that I would say that in the field of fighting impunity, it's not only the number of court rooms or such, but also the quality of justice that is being delivered.
Yeah. And do we have any way to measure the quality of justice being delivered? Well, or is that something to be developed?
That would be something to be being developed.
Yeah. President Türk.
Well, to put it simply, I think there is economists are familiar with the so-called Gini coefficient, named after Italian economist Corrado Gini, who actually calculated the inequalities through a specific coefficient. And that, I think, is a very good point of departure for anything, that we need everything beyond the GDP and other quantitative measurements. Now, we have to be aware of the complexity of the issue. I remember when I was president, I was watching the work in OECD and in other places. There was a study by three prominent economists, Amartya Sen, Joseph Stiglitz, and Fitoussi, about those issues, and that produced a report that thick, which was unfinished and was never finished. So it's not easy to come to a definitive answer, but we have a good point of departure. Corrado Gini coefficient. Let's start with that. Let's make it universally used, and let's then take policy decisions based on the need to improve the picture of each country based on the calculation on Gini coefficient.
Mm-hmm. Excellent. An existing framework that exists, but we haven't been using as well.
Sure.
Kristijan, let me go to you.
Yeah, just a very quick comment on the growth versus inequality discussion. On a purely sort of economic, rational choice, dispassionate basis, inequality doesn't necessarily have to be a problem as long as everybody is better off, even though gaps are widening. But of course, the world doesn't work that way, and we know that the political aspect is very important, and especially in a globalized world nowadays, it's not just about inequality within countries, but also between countries. And when you can see that people are living much better lives than you are elsewhere in the world, even if you yourself are living a better life than your parents did, or especially grandparents, it's still not going to matter to you and you're still going to be frustrated. So inequality is definitely something to focus on. And just a very brief point again on education. I referenced the PISA scores earlier in one of my interventions. It's very frustrating in a world that in many metrics has been developing in the right direction for the last couple of decades, that education scores have actually been going down in most developed countries.
Yeah. Perfect. Let me turn to audience questions. Could we get a show of hands? And then I'll try to take as many as I can. First, the lady at front. I think there should be a mic.
Well, thank you very much. I'm Ann Linde. I'm the former foreign minister of Sweden. One thing that is clear is that the normative changes from 1945 till now is immense. It's gender issues, it's climate issues, it's minority issues. And I know that President Türk, whom I've been working together with on the second charter, yes, also is very pessimistic. But is there something we can do in the Summit of the Future to let it show that there is now a new reality for women to take part, for you to take part, for climate action? There are proposals like every second or every third general secretary should be a woman, or that we should have a special council for nature resources and climate. But otherwise, could you give us some hope in changing the changed reality in normative sense could be reflected in the Summit of the Future? Thank you.
Yeah. President Türk, should we go to you first? You've been roughly pessimistic. Is there a note of optimism?
Yeah, well, look, I mean, I don't think I was particularly pessimistic. I just explained what the situation is and where a breakthrough may be needed, and that breakthrough depends on the political leaders. Now, Summit of the Future is an intergovernmental, interstate affair. And, you know, people who will be sitting there and taking decisions are heads of state and government. So, you know, my focus was on that. Obviously, there is a vast reality beyond that. And if one talks, for example, of equality of women, for example, that big problem, I think the Summit of the Future may not be the best moment for a breakthrough or for any major innovation. But next year, UN will organize a World Social Summit. And that will deal with social development in a more focused manner. And of course, 50% of population are women, and most affected part of the population as far as social policies are concerned are women again. So I would see that as an important opportunity to come with some innovative ideas. Now, whether that would change the reality or not, I cannot say. But there is a role for each of these events, and each of those roles is different. Minister, you know, you and I were recently discussing the idea of the second UN Charter. Now, that kind of idea cannot be adopted by the United Nations as an intergovernmental institution, but it has to be offered from elsewhere, from people like you and me, who produce proposals for which the time will come. And of course, maybe some elements of those proposals can be taken advantage of more early and others less later. So, you know, I'm not particularly pessimistic. I just see the reality as being very difficult and very complicated. And of course, this search for an approach has to take different directions, and different things have to be explored. One of them will be explored in the United Nations meetings directly, others in other places. And of course, we haven't touched upon all the problems that characterize multilateralism today. I mean, that you know, our discussion hasn't been complete, really. But I think that the discussion has shown some of the areas where breakthrough is most needed and where the responsibility of leaders of states is most visible. And that, I think, is there, and let's see what happens.
Ambassador, thank you.
Thank you, Minister. Just to answer very concretely, I would say youth. There's really a big sign of hope from the Summit of Youth of the Future on youth voices. I mean, there will be a dedicated document coming out in addition to the Pact of the Future with it on promoting youth voices and their role in addressing contemporary challenges. And this is really an important shift. I mean, we have not seen such a shift in recent years. And there's now a youth envoy office in the UN. There's an assistant secretary general, a youth assistant secretary general, and everywhere, regionally, internationally, there's really bringing forward youth voices in a way we haven't seen. And I think that is a sign of hope that I think the Summit of the Future will reflect, will crystallize this, and will give us a lot to build on also in terms of making sure that youth voices are better heard and youth are mobilized to address some of the challenges we have been talking about. Thank you.
Yeah. Excellent. Let's go to the gentleman in the first row. And if you could also state your name, your affiliation, and if your question is directed to the whole panel or to someone in particular.
I have a comment, a suggestion.
Sure.
Okay. Good morning, everyone. My name is Ibrahim Nuhum. I'm from Mali originally, but I'm from Slovenia also. I'm living in Slovenia for almost 45 years. And my question is, I want to say, to congratulate the organizer for this issue, because we are talking about parallel wars, different wars. And we are living on the same planet, but we are living in different worlds, in different realities. So we have to accept the realities and looking for solution. Maybe for a future, as an African, as a continent, coming from a continent, the second largest continent in the world, with a population of around 1,040,000 people, I request that Africa may have a permanent seat in UN, because we will not allow that another countries talk in our names. We are so intelligent also that we can talk our names. Okay, because we are living also in a reality, in different realities, we have to build somehow solidarity and help each other. You know, we know that there is a lot of problems in Africa concerning security, and we can help African countries they can have securities. But what has happened is that in African countries, we have a lot of insecurities, and people are not able to live correctly like in Europe. You know, if you realize, you know, here in Slovenia, every morning the children, they go to school, they have education, and they come back at home. This is not the fact in Sahel or in Sudan. I was in Sudan. This is such a beautiful country with beautiful people, peaceful people. But now what happened in Sudan is not, I don't want to take the floor, but I think that the understanding means that we have to see realities, and solidarity must be the key for our future and to help each other. If my neighbor have problems, I have to help him, not that I will come and add my problems on his problems. Thank you very much for the clear, and welcome in Slovenia, and please come back in Slovenia. This is a very beautiful country. Very beautiful country, really.
Thank you.
Yeah,
Thank you so much. And if you just go to the gentleman behind him.
Thank you very much. My name's Dr. Richard Edelman, and I'm asking the question on behalf of two things which I'm doing. So I'm the current chairman of the World Water Quality Alliance of the United Nations Environment Programme, but I'm also coordinating a program with regards to the socio-political effects of climate change, especially with regards to migration, gender equality, and conflict. And my question is that with my two aspects of my work, which I've just described, we have always been discovering the resistance of nation states to be able to give us even the data to be able to act on. Whereas the United Nations and the European Commission and the OECD, for example, and myself, we have always advocated the inclusion of cities, of municipalities, in order to be able to create a far more democratic atmosphere at a level where citizens can become truly engaged. My question is, do you think that the Summit of the Future, or, for example, the Social Summit for next year, can head towards further inclusion of municipalities and cities in order to guarantee, shall we say, not a successful democracy, but at least a step towards that? Thank you.
Yeah. And is that for the whole panel? Yeah. Anyone taking it first? It's not an easy question, yeah.
Well, I will be very brief. Yes, the short answer is yes. This is slowly happening, but it's happening too slowly. Now the UN is an intergovernmental organization, and it doesn't have an easy time in broadening the scope of its participation for different actors. I mean, there are mechanisms for that, but they are not adequate to the needs of our time. So further reforms are needed, and the second charter, which we have discussed in a different setting, is partly motivated by that need and offers some solutions for expanding the participation in the in the UN processes. So that would be one part of the answer. The second part is basic, serious reforms. I'm not going to be very detailed here, but COP conferences have become hijacked by oil lobby. So a major reform is needed. COP conferences have to be changed completely. Otherwise, they are not going to produce anything or can produce even problematic results. So, I mean, reforms.
Yeah. Just before I go to you, Ambassador, I want to echo that point about COP29. I was part of engaging with the dialogue process for this year's COP29, and there's one thing I learned, which if you can walk with one thing, is that last year's COP, there were twice as more fossil fuel and oil lobbyists as there were representatives from the 10 most vulnerable climate countries, right? So you think about climate negotiations, twice as more fossil fuel lobbyists than the people that are worst affected and their representatives. If we don't have an equal playing field built into the way that these multilateral frameworks work, we can't possibly hope for equal or equitable outcomes. Let me go to you, Ambassador.
Thank you. No, but on cities, and municipal, I think it's a very important point, and I think there's much more scope to include them in the responses to global challenges. Just wanted to point out that Egypt will host this year in November the World Urban Forum, which will be really an opportunity to put a spotlight on their important role. And I think there is proposals. I think the Secretary General has done an advisory also. Board on local government and how to better integrate them. So I think there's efforts, but I think they're a bit still fragmented. We've been trying also to tackle this in our forum and working more with governors in Africa who have, for example, in Nigeria, have a lot of executive power and who are the front lines, again, of fighting against terrorism. And they are well organized in terms of the networks of cities and mayors, but not sufficiently plugged in then into some of these global frameworks. And there's a kind of a bridging role to be done, working with their networks and their associations. And in the climate space, mayors and cities are very active, but we need them also on other issues, on migration, on peace, on some of these other issues. Thank you.
Yeah. I also think one of the roles that cities can play is also reactive, right? After these conferences happen. And you think about the Paris Agreement, when Donald Trump pulled out of the Paris Agreement, right? You had some countries speaking out against it, but it was also cities within the United States that said, actually, no, we're going to make sure that our city adheres to the Paris Agreements, even if on a federal level we're pulling out. And I think that coming to the fore more is an important idea. I think we have time for maybe 2 or 3 more questions if we can make it quick. Any hands in the audience? Yeah, can I go to the gentleman right at the back?
Mentioned today, we have SDGs as an attempt to measure what's going on with changes we want to achieve. or President Türk was mentioning Gini coefficient. So how you see the possibility of data-based policy, or at least confronting politics with the facts in the way these indicators may help us? I don't know if I'm clear with...
Yeah. Would you point it to anyone in particular?
President Türk or someone who feels like...
Okay, well, look, just very briefly, and I'm sure that Ambassador will have more to say about this. I think that United Nations has the best, or one of the best, statistical systems in the world. I mean, very credible, very complete, very realistic. The availability and reliability of statistical data is not perfect, it's not equal. So, I mean, there are problems. But the UN Statistical Commission and the Statistical Division of the Department of Economic and Social Affairs belong to the strongest but not very well advertised parts of the UN system. So I think that it is perfectly possible to do that. Now, in the implementation of Sustainable Development Goals, an attempt was made in 2015, 16, 17. Then, of course, it was discovered that the goals are so ambitious and have so many different targets that makes the project of statistical handling of this extremely difficult. And of course, the political circumstances were not helpful either. So I think what would be needed now is to agree on a more manageable core of statistical information so as to improve the quality of diagnostics. That could be done through statistics. And that's doable. That's doable. It just needs proper political and institutional support of the United Nations. And on that basis, of course, one can come to a more realistic perception of the implementation of Sustainable Development Goals, and that will be necessary anyway, because the year 2030 is approaching, and if there are leaders who want Sustainable Development Goals to continue, something like that has to be worked out.
Yeah. You know, there's a clock ticking, so I'll go right to my last question. Which will keep it to under 60 seconds, sort of rapid fire style for everyone. You know, I liked when Eddie Rama said yesterday on the opening leaders panel about how sometimes frustrating it is for young people to constantly get advice from the generations above them. And so often, when we talk about youth inclusion, Summit of the Future, bringing young people into the conversation, let me flip the question a little bit and put it to the panelists. What's one piece of advice that you have gotten in your career from a young person or learned from a young person that's been most helpful to you? Ambassador, can I start with you?
When I have, again, in the Aswan Forum, when we had a youth forum there also, and I'm very impressed. African youth are questioning, actually. You tell them this is how things, they question why are things this way, and it has really impacted me there. I mean, I'm a diplomat. I've been dealing with these international rules and norms and set up for many years, but it is being questioned fundamentally. Why certain countries have these positions to head international organizations forever and they inherit them. Why? Why is that the case? Why do we accept that? So it's the questioning of some of the things we take for granted that is really, I found, very refreshing and will have a lot of implications, again, for the future.
Mm-hmm. Madam President?
First, I would say that part of the youth are rather afraid of the future, and they see the climate change and those issues very as a gloomy future, and that of course really is painful for me to listen to that this is the world that we have given to our children. But on the other hand, I think I don't have any substantial advice, but I think. In general, many of the young people are really optimistic. They are very energetic. Ambassador said that they question our decisions and the way we've done things. So I think that also really is an advice for all of us that let's not give up.
And that optimism is infectious.
Yeah.
Mr. President.
Well, I think the young people have the unique capacity to surprise and confuse. I'm saying this on the basis of particular political experience. In Club de Madrid, we are organizing meetings with what we call young political leaders. And in one of those meetings, I asked a representative of those young leaders from Africa, how do they use social media? And the answer was, yes, well, that's wonderful, because we have discovered that the established politicians know nothing about social media, and they now became scared. And in one of the countries, the president started to convene tea parties with what is called influencers. And those influencers have huge fun when they go to the president's residence and they discuss things with him. They don't give any promises, but they keep the president alert. And, you know, young people will always be able to surprise. They will come with new things, and of course they will have to come with new things because, you know, the future of the world is theirs.
Mm-hmm. Fantastic. And Kristijan, let me go to you. What's an advice you've gotten from your peers, let's say?
Yeah, I mean, technically I'm still in the youth bracket, so I hope that Edi Rama wouldn't have a problem with me talking about my own generation. Of course, my generation has grown up with the issue of climate change as an existential issue for all of us. And one concern that I hear a lot from young people even younger than me, as a demographer, is that they're not considering having children because they don't think it's ethical to reproduce at a time of climate change. I'm not a big fan of this argument. I mean, I've never particularly understood it, but I sympathize with the sentiment, right? I sympathize with this anxiety among young people. And my answer to that usually is that we have this existential burden upon our shoulders, but we can't give up. The solution can't be, you know, to say, well, we live in a difficult world, so we'll just, you know, throw in the towel. We have to realize that we shouldn't individualize these issues, and the right ways to deal with climate change, of course, and any other challenges is to put pressure on our governments to come up with systemic solutions rather than individualizing the problem.
Yeah, fantastic. I'm just realizing that, you know, the panel was on Summit of the Future, and I think we, you know, incorporated almost every aspect of it, from migration, the, you know, deficit in democracy, from impunity and criminality, to the perspectives from the Global South and the international framework or on finances. So, you know, what an exceptional panel. And let me also just make one final comment, which is let's make sure that this discussion doesn't die here. You know, I feel that people at Bled are a little bit shy sometimes. So when we move out of this room, let's make sure, I'm sure all the panelists are happy to speak to the audience and vice versa. Let's make sure that if you spot any of us in any of the break sessions, we come and we have this conversation, and we keep it going, and that you keep it going with the youth participants here in particular. And with that, can we please give a huge round of applause to our brilliant panelists?